minutes. I want to start off with Andy, though. So Meridian, what, as they say, what does success look like for Meridian? What's the end goal? What kind of timescales are we talking?
Very good question. So Meridian isn't supposed to end. So when you look towards success for anything that's nationally important, then you don't want to remain as a project that then just hands over and hopes after a short amount of time. Market failures are constantly evolving, and international competition is constantly evolving. So we have a number of centres of excellence in the UK, either in academia or within the private sector, that we should be marketing on the international stage for as long as they exist and have some relevance. So that's one element of what Meridian is here to do, is to make sure the world knows that the UK has skills and capabilities that are relevant now and no doubt will continue to be relevant as they evolve. Also, the world wants to see that the UK government and the industry is both united and relevant to today's technology and potentially to tomorrow's technology. And again, when does that stop being relevant? In 5 years' time, it won't be, well, CAV's done, everybody's got one, let's carry on. In 10 years, it won't be like that, and it'll be something new in the future. The outcome that we're looking for is progress towards the future of mobility. And today, that's connected and autonomous vehicles, and for a while it still will be. And eventually there'll be a lot more to do, and we'll still need to signal and coordinate and work together to make sure that we have the biggest impact, both from a productivity point of view, running our country better for the best outcome, less congestion, etc., but also to be able to see that the UK's economic growth is in line with what we should be expecting. We've got some of the best engineering centres in the world here, systems engineers, infrastructure. Well, that's what we're here for today. There's a number of capabilities here in the room and outside in the show that are internationally relevant right now. And while we're in flux, we should be capitalising on it, but it should never go away. So the answer is, there isn't an end for Meridian. The future of mobility is what we're here to provide and provide guidance for, and success looks like UK economic growth, productivity gains. They're not short-term answers. That's the tricky bit. So constant industrial and UK government engagement is key.
Okay, let's go into some of the challenges and let's talk about testing, because so many of you are involved in testing. So, Chris, we'll start with you. What's the biggest challenge of testing? What have you come across so far, because you've been doing this for a while now, that's surprised you, that's been a bit of a hurdle?
I think the single biggest challenge that we face from testing is actually how do we cover the scope of testing that is required. The potential range of use cases and the potential range of test scenarios that we require to understand whether the systems are safe is almost infinite. So what we are working on is actually how do we understand how we use simulation and modelling techniques to look at those very broad range of use cases and going right out to the edge cases as well. And then understanding the subset of randomised physical testing that we need to employ to correlate back to that simulation and modelling, so we have a high degree of confidence in actually what we are testing, both in the simulation space and also in the controlled environment physical test, which then gives us a high degree of confidence, or as the phrase that I would use, we can manage the risk of this technology when we deploy it into our public roads and into the public environments that organisations like WMG are leading and creating.
And Peter, what is a high degree of confidence? When is that point where you can say, all right, real roads now?
That's a great question. When we have people come to us and say, can you test to make it safe? And the immediate question is, test to what? What standard? What is the autonomous vehicle driving license at the end of it? And it's still being worked on. There's still no UK, national, international, global standards that these things should do. So there is a self-certification approach which has been taken in the US with differing degrees of success depending on who you deal with. Europe will be looking at doing something in terms of a prescribed regulation, but at this stage it's really open. I guess one of the areas is are you able to convince an insurer to give you cover? Which again is something that's starting to look at. Some people will self-insure if they go on the public roads, but a lot of it rides around that question. Is it roadworthiness? Can you get somebody to insure it? And are you confident in what you're doing? So it's still very early days for us.
Paul, is there a danger with testing that when something goes wrong, the whole thing gets set back?
Nope.
Is this a danger that when you keep testing and something goes wrong in the real world, it makes the papers and people like me cover it, and it throws everything back years, and therefore no one really wants to take the risk because they know the consequence of getting it wrong, even if it wasn't the computer's fault or whatever, is so large. Is there a tentativeness about this kind of real world testing?
I think possibly. I think public engagement and public perspective is really, really important, as you say. I think it's really important that we're doing this because it's going to benefit people, that they can see the advantages. I think trying to stress the long-term benefits from this technology are important to me. Every year in the UK, there are 1,500 to 2,000 fatalities on our roads. 90% of those accidents are down to human error. So long-term, if we get this right, we can save lives. It is a long journey, and I'm sure we'll talk about timescales later. But the benefits are huge. We need to understand that. I think when you say about accidents, that potentially can put things back. But I think from the testing perspective, actually we learn more. Now, not saying that should be in the public domain, but very often we hear about the number of miles that vehicles have driven safely. I would suggest that actually we're not learning much from that. What we want to know is actually when do these vehicles fail? And actually trying to understand what might cause those failures. Now, I think ideally we'd do that in a simulation domain, but I think we'll learn far more from understanding why they fail than just being able to say that they can drive many, many miles, maybe on a nice sunny road in Southern California.
We were talking about this. How do you make a system fail? Because you've got to fool a computer, haven't you? This is something you're involved with.
It is, and again, it's looking at what the edge cases are. I mean, I guess. And in some of those cases, for instance, there was an incident with Tesla recently in Florida, and that was where the vehicle was driving directly into sunlight, which actually is pretty tough for a human driver as well. Certainly, I know when you drive directly into sunlight, especially if there's sort of maybe water on the road as well, that can be quite a difficult scenario. So I think, so there are some known scenarios, and there are others that perhaps we don't know about.
Rob, how did the public react to your vehicles out and about in the streets?
I think it's been really interesting. I mean, you're probably referring specifically to the Gateway program that we ran over a couple of years. That was a very successful last mile kind of shuttle service in Greenwich, but also some other projects we've been doing. And I think what we've particularly learned from that is that members of the public are very worried, they're very scared, they're very nervous of this kind of new technology because it's unknown. And typically about 5 minutes later when they've had a ride, they want to go again. So it's a bit like getting on a helter-skelter or something that, until you've experienced it, you're just concerned about it. And then probably there's a risk of them being overconfident, having had a ride on it and think, actually, I didn't crash, I didn't get hurt, so this must be safe now. So we're finding that the public perception of these kinds of technologies is very much dependent on whether or not they've touched and felt it, whether they personally experienced it. And I think that's one of our challenges, is not getting the technology right, not necessarily getting the regulatory and the standards environment right, or even the insurance issues, all of which are really, really important to fix, but also how we educate the consumer about how this will change their life.
Let's go to the screens, as they say. I'm not sure who can answer this one, but do white lines matter? Can
yes
someone
and no.
come up with something on that? Okay.
So it's a good question, because at the moment in the UK, there's a high percentage of white lines and traffic signs which are not fit for purpose. So depending on how you're trying to navigate and the rules set within a connected autonomous vehicle, they could have an impact. So there's a case for improved road markings and road signs. There's also a case in the future for, will they be fully digitized? But white lines are a factor at the moment that has to be improved either way.
And what about things like snow as well? So I was in Gothenburg testing the Volvo model, driving along quite happily, and they were going to have commuters going to and from work in this Volvo car, fully autonomous, but they couldn't do it in the snow in Gothenburg.
Yeah. I'll start that answer, and then I think Peter will chip in. So I think the whole thing about geography and how we do certain tests for it is really important. What we don't want to be doing globally is tests that are standard, which you could either do in simulation and are not an edge case. We want to try and do in the real world the edge cases, which are not standard, and therefore we don't repeat a mistake that somebody else has done many times. But secondly, and this is what Meridian's trying to coordinate internationally, is attract people to the UK for our geographies, but equally understand that other geographies around the world are useful for any innovator to go away and test on. And I think Peter's got an example on his side.
Yeah, I think, well, certainly from where I live, white lines really don't matter because most of the roads near me have been top dressed recently and it's taken 6 weeks to put the lines back on. So you can't be immobile because of that. I think a vision system is just one way of determining where you are. There's lots of work going on with locations and various other inferences, and it has to be a fusion of different sensors to really understand where you are. You can't just rely on one system, whether it be a visual camera, infrared, LiDAR, radar. You have to fuse it all together, and so you're inferring where you are and what you're going to do next, rather than just using one thing. So at the end, if it's snowy, if it's dusty, if there's drifts on the side of the road, that sort of thing, it has to be a system that can do without any of those visual cues to progress.
Yeah, do white lines matter? Yes, they do. Quite simply, our roads will be used by many users for the foreseeable future, so we have to assume that we will have mixed fleets where we have conventional vehicles, we have cyclists, we have other vulnerable road users using our roads, so we will need to maintain white lines. The automated technology will, by and large, have to operate within the existing infrastructure that we have.
There was another question on here, it's just a bit off now, but it was about cyber security, Andy. So what role is cyber security playing in your work? Because obviously it's a huge issue.
Huge. And it could be leveled that we've not addressed it quickly enough, not just in the UK but globally. But right now I can say that it's priority number one for the consortium here and the people that we're engaged with. So the tricky thing that we find is the skills that we have in the UK, and it's a significant capability in the UK for cybersecurity, don't necessarily operate within the automotive, roads, or other sectors. They have other things, national security, they're working in IT, they're working in aerospace, etc. To try and attract them to come and deploy those skills and to help us to make sure this is safe, we need to create something just as exciting and just as fulfilling for them in employment and future opportunity. That's happening right now. So that's the engagement with Meridian and the National Cybersecurity Centre and GCHQ trying to collaborate and run future programs that will see more people come into this space. That's one way of trying to solve the problem of future skills. The technical problem, which is incredibly difficult, especially for me to try and describe, is frightening. So every time I'm at a workshop on this subject, and the panel members here are there, something new comes out, a statement from somebody clever who does this for a living that frightens you. And the one that is, and I haven't found anybody to disagree with, is that this is the only IT scale safety critical operational problem that the world faces. So if that, as a description, mobile phones or laptops are IT scale. So if they all fail tomorrow or all hacked, they probably won't kill us all or have a significant safety implication for us. Probably not. Maybe in some cases, but rarely. If we're now, or if we're in the future, we're in a world of connectivity, not necessarily even autonomy, then we have an IT scale, in volume terms, safety critical issue. So the methodologies with which we need as a society to approach this exist, but they exist in other marketplaces at this stage, concentrating on getting your laptop back up and running, and potentially then they're not integrated with the people who understand how to provide national security. We need to provide this IT scale thinking and a national security element, and that's part of what Meridian is doing now, is joining those with these guys in the room and other people outside here, is joining the thinking up, so that actually not only have we protected ourselves as a country or got further in towards protecting ourselves, we're understanding how to fail operational, because inevitably things will go wrong, but we've also got a skill and a capability that the world is looking for, that we're really good at. So it's got a productivity and an export gain for all involved. But it is priority number one. Safety is priority number one. This is right front and centre.
Has it formed part of any of your projects, the cyber side of things? Chris?
Yes. Certainly cybersecurity is embedded in all the projects that we're working in, and also we actually are funded via the Centre of Connected and Autonomous Vehicles to actually look at some of the cybersecurity aspects of connected and autonomous vehicles and understand the type of frameworks, methodologies and principles that we need to employ as an industry to ensure that we manage the threat associated with cybersecurity. And for me, it's all about managing the threat. I don't think anyone could sit here and say these things will be 100% cyber secure. We just have to be able to get them to a point where we can manage that risk, and it's a risk that is acceptable to the public. So there's a lot of work taking place, and we're building on existing best practices that exist out there, and we're also leveraging on the UK is one of the leading nations in cybersecurity, and we're leveraging that expertise to ensure that these systems are actually safe and secure.
Rob, there was oh yeah, Paul?
So, yes, we're working on cybersecurity too, and some of the projects actually involve Chris and Myra. But I guess it may be worth just mentioning that that always applies to the C of CAV, but not always to the A. There are some schools of thought where people are trying to keep the intelligence entirely on the vehicle and not be dependent from any other source. And because the same might apply as if you lost signal rather than necessarily a cybersecurity attack. So there are some schools of thought for autonomy where the vehicle is being developed such that it can actually have the sufficient intelligence just on board and not rely on any signal externally.
Jim, how does it fit in with your work as well? Because if you're gobbling up lots of data about what's around, and you're taking pictures of people presumably, and there's how big is the security threat with that?
So when people, there's certain rules about capture which protect people's privacy. So, and a lot of forward-facing cameras or different devices in vehicles, if they're being captured for a certain purpose, will anonymise car registrations, faces. So as part of the research, that's part of that filtering. The other thing about security, in terms of the new navigation methods, we have a project called geosecurity, GeoSec. If you imagine, I'm about to have a platoon of vehicles. One of those has to be the leader and then broadcast its position to the other vehicles in that platoon. You need a very fast way of securing, but creating an anonymized group of vehicles. And the question is, what is the fastest way to do that, but allow them to make those maneuvers? Equally, if the position of those vehicles is all different, should you allow them, for example, they might have different tolerances, plus and minuses on the calculations. Do I allow them to platoon in the first place? So that whole geo-security, that whole thing about the location of position for the maneuver you want to make is really important.
Rob, there was a good question on here about, and I love this area, it's the transition period, because everyone's got an image of people bullying, autonomous cars, bullying them off the roads. I was hearing about some of the projects in, Milton Keynes and Coventry, and how people cross the road in different ways, and
yes.
Students were having a little pop at the autonomous car and so on. Is there a real issue with that transition period when the road is being shared, or do you think it's being a bit overhyped?
No, I think we will have that challenge, and I remember on our Gateway program, you on camera stood in front just to see whether or not it would actually stop. And so people will try and interfere with or test and validate for themselves whether these things are safe and perhaps disrupt the services. But I see this is not dissimilar really to the shift we saw 100 years ago from horses and carriages into motor vehicles. People would start to interfere with the early automobiles and try to interfere with them making any real progress. But eventually society adapts and adopts, and then you get mass adoption over time, and I think that's the journey we're on.
Peter, do you see that as the big sort of trouble point?
It's something we're starting to look at in terms of what's happening where we work today. We have some vehicles driven in an autonomous manner, mixing it with a professional test driver. So we're starting to look at what are the procedures we need to put in place for this mixed traffic. So are they going to do something unexpected, or or not. So yes, it's very uppermost in our minds, the transition time period, interacting with normal vehicles running in normal ways, but also in abnormal ways as well, because people will do the unexpected.
I want to talk about collaboration now. So Andy, this is what you're all about, really, isn't it? Bringing different people together who wouldn't necessarily kind of be sharing secrets normally. I won't point to anyone on the panel, but, you know, they're commercial companies. They've got to make money. Where is that line between car makers going off and doing their own thing and actually producing things that are incompatible and collaborating? How's it gone so far?
Well, you get an infographic a day on LinkedIn now, don't you, about who's been bought by who and signed up a deal with who. So if you look back maybe 5-10 years and where the car companies and other infrastructure providers were siloed, you know, big companies, their long-term vision didn't necessarily include having relationships with their direct competitors in their classification of vehicles. But then every day now you'll see significant investment from Honda and GM where they're working together. The lines of collaboration now are more blurred than they've ever been. And that's fantastic in a way. No doubt the world will become smaller and they'll start to form their own consortium of 2 or 3. But for right now, especially in the UK, the momentum and the amount of collaboration that we can show, and we can show outside of the country to show, look how collaborative we are, is significant. Right up there with some of the best, if not the best. And we get measured on this every so often by KPMG or whoever, say most collaborative countries in the world or most innovative countries in the world. And we're right there, if not 1, we're 2, or we're 3. So there's evidence basis for how much our companies are prepared to work together to make sure that there is a commercial and societal outcome for the UK, which is great news. There's always more to be done. It's key, and I mentioned this before today, it's key, though, that it's seen that the government has a role here, the industry has a role here, and we still have a great government-industry relationship that must maintain itself, because that's when industry's long-term desires can be assisted, they can be envisioned, they could be helped to regulate towards by the people within government, and again, that's a relatively unique proposition around the world.
Chris, oh yeah, Rob.
Can I just add to Andy's comments? I completely agree. I mean, for TRL, collaboration is absolutely crucial. I mean, yes, we're all commercial businesses kind of looking after our own enterprises, but if I look at what's really going on in the world, and I mentioned it in my earlier comments, there is so much money being spent and so much momentum globally. The only way the UK as a country can really play its part is by demonstrating it can collaborate around innovation. I don't think we have the financial resources to really compete with the US or with China, or indeed perhaps with Germany on some of the things that they're doing. So what we're doing is something different, and we're demonstrating that through collaboration we're removing duplication. A lot of the money being spent in the US in particular, whilst it's vast amounts of money, it's very duplicating. There are lots of companies doing exactly the same thing and racing to be first. And I think what we're doing differently in the UK, which is making us arguably a world-leading country on this topic, is demonstrating collaboration through innovation.
I was reading about the number of new patents in Silicon Valley, about autonomous car patents being a ridiculously huge number. I mean, Paul, how do we compete? Because I suppose Britain has a bit of a reputation for being good at the ideas,
Yep.
and then someone else just grabs it, you know, makes it commercially viable. How can we really take on Silicon Valley and China realistically? Or is it more realistic that we would have a smaller, more specialized role and be very good at that?
I think it's both. I think, as has already been said, collaboration is essential, and I think it's encouraging that the sort of projects that are emerging through the Centre for Connected Autonomous Vehicles and Innovate UK, those consortia are involving not just vehicle manufacturers, but the technology suppliers, local authorities, insurance companies, law firms. And if you look at what needs to happen to make it work in the UK, the investment, and I think one of the questions that popped up was around investment in the infrastructure. What we're looking at is this isn't just a case of people buying cars. We're moving towards a service, and we also need to look at how authorities might invest for the infrastructure. And there we need to look at benefits in terms of the potential traffic flow benefits, the safety benefits, to be able to look at, we can demonstrate that as well as looking at individual people at an individual level. So we need to look at the societal benefits, and we need to look at individual benefits. Well,
let's take that question, because it is a good question. Who's going to pay for the infrastructure? Because we can we can make the case that everyone benefits, but someone's got to pay. Councils are strapped and can't repair their roads. I mean, where does the money come from?
They would need to look at a very long-term case, I believe. So they need to look at the fact that there will be genuine benefits for their citizens, and that could be in terms of safety, and that could be in terms of reduced congestion.
Peter, can you give us an idea about what kind of infrastructure we might be talking about? Because I think of a CAV as something that's, going around on its own. What would you need to build and add around it to make it work, and how much might it cost?
I think a lot of it is they need to know a few things. So where it is, and that's really important, and that's how everybody's working with Jim and understanding. So these things know, where am I? Then it's a question of what's around me as well. So what's the environment? What am I going and what am I going to do next? So there are some schools of thoughts that look at high density 4G, 5G cells running down major transport corridors with masts every 300 meters or so, which may be fine for a very high use highway to get an awful lot of data in and out of these vehicles. In a rural area, it's not going to be the same. It may be cellular, it may be some other combination of Wi-Fi. I think what's important is that for each particular scenario, there's a minimum viable infrastructure prepared, so everybody knows what is good to deploy in a disconnected rural place, a highly connected highways environment, and an ultra-dense city. So it will vary depending on the density of these vehicles, what they have to interact with, and what they have to share with each other. So I think it depends on density, population, road type. There's no one magic answer at the minute.
Jim, but how does it work for you? How do you get your data? Do you need to build anything to sort of gobble it up? Or in practical terms, what do you need to do to map the country?
Okay.
Is that quite a complex question to answer?
I was preparing to answer your earlier question on investment, which is
go
related.
for that one then. Who should pay, do you think?
Okay, so it's not a case of just who will pay, it's also when will you pay, right? So the good news is there's lots of data and evidence from 100 EU and US projects where if you invest earlier, the value add for all partners is bigger, especially on infrastructure. And the reason is, if you leave it up to market forces and you leave the investment trickle forward based on competition and everything else, then the value is less and it's more drawn out. And for the citizens, they'll also get the benefits less. So there's some argument that says things like CAV should be utility and we should be entice them in any geography, right? The only way that's going to happen is through collaboration and through some of our projects where we provide the data and evidence to make those early investments. So Meridian and others have done really well to get some early investment, but we're now creating more data and evidence to get a better coordinated offer.
Okay, here's a question for you all. What is an autonomous vehicle? We were saying this earlier. So is it like a pod that you go around in? Is it something we all share and you call to your door? Is it something you go to a showroom and buy? Is there any sense yet of what it actually is? Who wants to start with that? Andy?
Okay, it's all of the above, in my opinion. So you look at it as a very complex world of vehicles today. There are shuttle buses, there are bikes, there are car share schemes as individual. All of the modes of transport that we see around us have the opportunity to take some benefit from connectivity and automation. Some more than others, for sure. And you'll see a prevalence of pods in urban density areas and pedestrianised areas maybe, and there'll be areas in the rural locations where that won't be relevant or appropriate, so you'll need another type of vehicle. There'll be communities that like to share for good reason. There'll be communities that don't for good reason. As always, there won't be a silver bullet. There won't be, this is an autonomous car, and this is what everybody buys. There'll be just as many opportunities to get mobility now, privately, I suggest, or as a service, locally, urban, rural, integrated with your other transport modes as well, because we've talked about service mobility as a service. Maybe the provision is coming from people we don't even understand today. Maybe your road transport of the future is provided by your rail partner. Who knows? But just as many, if not more options than there are today. Whether that causes an issue for the public or whether that creates an opportunity for the public, the market will decide, because they'll only choose the one, whether it's the simplest version or whether it's the most varied option. I think the personalisation of transport will show where the market really wants it to be. The public will choose.
Rob, how do you think it's going to pan out? Do you think there'll be, like you says, lots of different ways at first, and then eventually everyone realises one is the best way to go? In 20 years' time, everyone's sharing a vehicle, or?
Well, I think we're going to see a whole mixture of things happening in the short term. But to kind of specifically answer your question, what is an autonomous vehicle? I think it's a vehicle you don't own. Because I think what we will end up with eventually is a situation where people don't want to buy these vehicles. They're too complex. Managing them as a fleet of services and so on is not something consumers will want to do. I think this will shift over time to a public transport type service. It might be operated and managed by commercial businesses, but what we see in cities today in terms of bus and tube and taxi services and so on, so an on-demand ride-sharing model. I think for the OEMs that's a real challenge, because for them their product is very much around the driving experience in a lot of cases, and I think they're having a bit of their Kodak moment at the moment, because they're going to be manufacturing vehicle product perhaps to sell to major fleet companies who will operate these services rather than to you and I as public consumers.
Yeah, Paul, who do you think drives this in the end? I mean, is it the car companies, or is it, governments, or is it actually techs?
I think it should be for the public. I think it should be because it's benefiting people. You ask what an autonomous vehicle is. It may be a minor point, but I'm not sure I like the word autonomous. Autonomous implies that you're a bit out of control. I prefer to maybe letting the driving being automated, because I think ultimately the vehicles should be there because they're making lives better for us. So I think it comes down to actually looking at the societal benefits, looking at the benefits to people, and that human element is really, really important.
It's an interesting. How do you get your voice heard then, as the general public?
I think engagement is really important. We run lots of sessions where we talk to the public around what this might mean for them, what they understand by driverless or autonomous or automated vehicle. We run studies to make sure that the technology isn't just pushed by engineers and technologists. We do evaluations where we bring a much more representative sample of people in to actually sort of be able to experience and be able to help to almost co-design some of the technology. I think it's been mentioned before that once you actually experience the technology or these vehicles, suddenly maybe your perception changes. So I think it's really important to engage everybody in the move forward. So as well as collaborating between all the experts, I think we should collaborate with the general public as well.
Chris, what do you think the single biggest benefit is? Is it, saving lives ultimately, fewer crashes? Is it going to be better for the environment? Do we actually know it's going to be better for the environment, for example?
Yeah, I think I'll sum it up in 3 words: safety, efficiency and convenience. And I actually think automation, you can't give a yes or no answer to that. Automation is a continuum. So what we'll see is in traditional OEMs, ever increasing levels of automated functions in the vehicle, going through an evolutionary approach, and they're already there in vehicles today. Things like automated emergency braking systems through to parking assist modules, etc. And that's sort of an incremental approach to ever increasing levels of automation. But then we're seeing the revolutionary approaches, particularly relating to pod type technologies, where they're going in at the very high levels of automation, and where we can actually start talking about an autonomous system. But what will actually drive this is the consumer, and where the consumer can understand where those safety, efficiency and convenience benefits actually apply to them.
I'm going to end on one of these questions here, but just quickly, does anyone have a question from the audience? If you put your hand up, we can get a microphone to you, or I can just come to one on the screen. That's it. Well, let's round up with this. Let's do kind of like in the pub, where you go once around the table. And we'll start with you, Jim. Do panel members believe we will ever reach full autonomy on all roads? And we were having a hot debate last night at the Laureate Awards, where around the table, half the people thought it would just end up on motorways, but you wouldn't get it on the sort of really hyper-dynamic environments, and the other half of people thought it would never happen at all. There was a lot of skepticism. What's your view? Do you think we're going to get full autonomy where no one is driving on all roads?
I think if we lose the levers of collaboration, sharing data and industrial strategy, we'll be able to do it on all roads.
I think despite all the evolution, we still haven't dispensed with horses for transport in certain environments. They're still around. To me, they're a really interesting level 4 vehicle as well in terms of their autonomy level. I think it will still be mixed going forward for quite some time. As a car guy, I'm a little bit worried that something that's built in 5 years' term might not have the chance to become a future classic, but that's something I've got to deal with myself. Yes. So I think it'll still be a long tail on all of this.
So one day I am hoping to get my, Series 1 Esprit. So, hopefully I can still drive it. Paul, what's your view?
I think in terms of achieving the full level 5 driving, I think yes, it will happen. I think it's the timescale that will be debated. So I think it will happen. It's just it could be a very long time away.
Rob?
I'll just add the word materially. I think materially, yes, it will happen. And what I mean by materially is I see this very much like the rollout of mobile telephony. You hear all these big mobile phone companies and they talk about the amount of coverage, and they're talking about the amount of coverage in terms of access to members of the population and not necessarily geographic coverage. So I think there will be extremities of our road network that are just that little bit too difficult to make work in the right way. But for everywhere that it's really important and there is enough demand, we will have automation.
Chris?
I think the short answer is yes, but it's a long way out, and the autonomous system will have to be capable of operating within a mixed fleet within our environments.
Andy, I'll leave the last word with you.
You knew I was going to say yes, and I am going to say yes. And I think maybe it's some of the interesting things on the panel today were about what happened 100 years ago when the horse-to-car transition happened, and how quickly did it happen compared to forecasts. It happened a lot quicker than everybody forecasted, and if anything, that change ratio has accelerated over the last 100 years. So when we think about how adoption rates come through now, I know this is safety critical, but when the market, if the market, and let's say when the market sees and feels the benefits economically or socially of one use case, dense populated area, urban area, then why would they not want it right now? Lobby their local government, lobby their MP, lobby their companies. More than that, why wouldn't commercial companies around the world not see, well, they do want it. See, this really does work. And I suspect the pace of change will be a lot quicker once it's been proved, than people are forecasting right now. I don't see a 50 years before half the population are even considering it. I don't see that at all. I think we move faster than that.
Well, thank you so much for such a stimulating debate.